The morning of October 15th, 1943, over Bougainville Island, Lieutenant Junior Grade Tom Blackburn watched something that should have saved the 4 Japanese Zero pilots circling below him. They'd formed a perfect defensive wheel, each fighter positioned to protect the tail of the aircraft ahead, rotating in a continuous circle that presented no easy target. It was the Lufbery Circle, named after the French-American ace Raoul Lufbery, who'd perfected the maneuver in World War I. For 25 years, this tactic had been considered the ultimate defensive formation for outnumbered fighters. The Japanese had used it successfully against American fighters throughout 1942, forcing attackers to either break off or risk flying into a crossfire. But Blackburn was flying an F4U Corsair, not a Wildcat. And what those Japanese pilots didn't understand yet was that the same defensive circle that had saved their lives dozens of times before was about to kill them all. The Lufbery Circle emerged from the desperate mathematics of World War I aerial combat. When a lone fighter or small formation found itself outnumbered, pilots would form a defensive circle, flying in a continuous turn with each aircraft covering the one ahead. Any attacker who dove on one aircraft would immediately expose himself to fire from others in the circle. The geometry was elegant and the psychology was sound. Attackers had to choose between breaking off without scoring a kill or pressing an attack while flying into defensive fire from multiple angles. Most chose to break off. The tactic worked because World War I fighters had relatively similar performance characteristics. A Sopwith Camel and a Fokker D7 could both turn, both climb, and both dive within roughly comparable parameters. The defensive circle exploited mutual support rather than individual aircraft performance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Japanese naval aviators adopted the Lufbery Circle during their operations over China in the 1930s. The Mitsubishi, a 5M, predecessor to the famous Zero, used the formation effectively against Chinese fighters. When the A6M0 entered service in 1940, Japanese pilots continued employing the tactic because it leveraged the Zero's extraordinary turning ability. A defensive circle of Zeros was nearly impenetrable. Each Zero could complete a 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at combat speeds. Any American fighter that tried to break the circle had to commit to a turning engagement inside the Zero's turn radius, which meant flying predictably through a cone of fire from multiple defending aircraft. During the desperate fighting of 1942, American Wildcat pilots encountered the Lufbery Circle repeatedly. Japanese pilots would form the defensive wheel when outnumbered or surprised, and American attackers found themselves frustrated by the tactic. Diving attacks that worked against individual targets became far more dangerous against a coordinated circle. The mathematics were unforgiving. To shoot down one aircraft in the circle, an attacker had to fly through the defensive fire of 3 or 4 others. Even if the attacking pilot's gunnery was perfect, the defensive pilots only needed to land a few hits to damage or destroy the attacker. The exchange rate favored the defenders overwhelmingly. Squadron commanders analyzed combat reports and struggled with the problem. How do you break a defensive formation that's been refined over 25 years of aerial combat? The conventional answer was numerical superiority. If you had 8 fighters attacking 4 defenders in a Lufbery Circle, you could assign 2 attackers to each defender and accept that some attackers would be damaged or lost. But this approach required significant numerical advantage and produced casualty rates that were strategically unsustainable. The American naval aviation needed something better than simply throwing more aircraft and pilots at a proven defensive tactic. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair entered combat in the Solomon Islands during February 1943, and it brought capabilities that fundamentally altered the tactical equation. The Corsair was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the same 18-cylinder radial powerhouse that drove the F6F Hellcat. This engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. But raw power was only part of the story. The Corsair's distinctive inverted gull wing design allowed engineers to use a massive 13-foot 4-inch propeller, while keeping the landing gear relatively short for carrier operations. That huge propeller converted engine power into thrust with exceptional efficiency. The performance, numbers told the story clearly. The F4U, the first major production variant, could reach a maximum speed of 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet. The Zero, by comparison, maxed out at 331 miles per hour. More importantly, for breaking defensive circles, the Corsair could climb at 2,890 feet per minute at sea level and sustain climb rates above 3,000 feet per minute at optimal altitude. The Zero climbed at 2,580 feet per minute initially, but its climb rate degraded more rapidly with altitude due to its single-stage supercharger. These weren't just impressive statistics in a technical manual. They translated to tactical capabilities that American pilots were only beginning to understand in early 1943. A Corsair could dive on a target at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, make a firing pass, and then climb away faster than a Zero, but could follow. The defending Zero pilot could turn and twist beautifully, but if the Corsair pilot simply pointed his nose upward and applied full power, the Japanese fighter couldn't catch him. This changed everything about how defensive circles functioned. Marine Fighting Squadron 214, VMF 214, the unit that would later become famous as the Black Sheep Squadron under Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, was among the first to receive Corsairs in significant numbers. The squadron arrived at Guadalcanal's Henderson Field in September 1943. Boyington, already an experienced combat pilot with 6 confirmed victories flying with the Flying Tigers in China, immediately recognized that the Corsair demanded different tactics than the Wildcat. During training flights, he experimented with vertical maneuvers, pushing the aircraft through climbing attacks and diving recoveries that would have been impossible in earlier American fighters. On September 16, 1943, Boyington led a division of 4 Corsairs on a fighter sweep over Bougainville Island. They encountered a formation of approximately 15 Zeros, and several Japanese fighters immediately formed a defensive Lufbery Circle when the Americans bounced them from altitude. In previous engagements with Wildcats, this defensive formation would have ended the attack. The American pilots would have made 1 or 2 cautious passes and then disengaged, unable to break the circle without accepting unacceptable losses. But Boyington had been thinking about this problem. He directed his wingmen to maintain altitude while he made the first attack alone. Boyington dove from 20,000 feet, accelerating to over 400 miles per hour. He selected a Zero in the defensive circle and opened fire from 1,200 feet, closing rapidly. His 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, poured approximately 100 rounds into the target in a 2-second burst. The Zero staggered as armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through its unprotected fuel tanks and engine. But Boyington didn't watch the results. The moment he finished firing, he pulled back on the stick and climbed vertically. The other 3 Zeros in the circle immediately turned toward Boyington's attack line, exactly as their training dictated. They expected the American fighter to either continue straight through the circle, giving them deflection shots, or pull up into a climbing turn that would bleed off energy and make the Corsair vulnerable. Instead, Boyington's aircraft simply climbed straight up at an angle that no Zero could match. The Japanese pilots pulled their noses up, trying to track the departing Corsair, but their aircraft were already in a turning circle at relatively low speed. Converting from a horizontal turn into a vertical climb while maintaining enough energy to actually catch the American fighter was impossible. Boyington leveled off at 24,000 feet, assessed the situation below, and dove again. This time he attacked from a different angle, forcing the remaining Zeros to adjust their defensive circle. Another 2-second burst, another Zero trailing smoke and falling away from the formation. Another vertical climb that left Japanese pilots straining uselessly to elevate their noses enough to get guns on target. The defensive circle that had protected these pilots dozens of times before was becoming a trap. They couldn't scatter because individual Zeros would be easy prey for the other 3 Corsairs circling above. They couldn't maintain the circle because Corsair pilots could attack at will and escape before effective defensive fire could be brought to bear. And they couldn't climb to engage the Americans at altitude because the Corsairs would simply extend away vertically. The engagement lasted approximately 8 minutes. Boyington's division shot down 5 Zeros without taking a single hit. The surviving Japanese fighters finally broke the circle and dove away toward their base at Rabaul, abandoning the formation that was supposed to save them. Boyington's after-action report described the attack in understated terms, but his conclusion was significant. He noted that the Corsairs' vertical performance allowed pilots to attack defensive formations that had previously been considered too dangerous to engage. The report recommended that other Corsair squadrons experiment with similar tactics against Lufbery Circles. The word spread quickly through Marine and Navy fighter squadrons transitioning to Corsairs throughout late 1943. The defensive circle wasn't invulnerable anymore. It had become what pilots called a shooting gallery, a static formation that allowed attackers with superior vertical performance to engage at will. Japanese pilots didn't understand this yet. Their training and doctrine still emphasized the Lufbery Circle as the primary defensive tactic for outnumbered fighters. They'd used it successfully for years. The fact that it had suddenly stopped working wasn't immediately obvious from the Japanese perspective. A Zero pilot who formed a defensive circle with his squadron mates and then watched American fighters climb away after making attacks might reasonably conclude that the tactic had worked. The Americans had attacked and then disengaged, which meant the defensive formation had denied them an easy victory. What these Japanese pilots didn't realize was that the Americans were disengaging by choice, not necessity. They were climbing away to set up another attack, not fleeing from defensive fire. The distinction was subtle but absolutely critical. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, commanding officer of VMF 212, another Corsair squadron operating from Guadalcanal, described the tactical shift in a letter to a fellow squadron commander in October 1943. The letter, preserved in Marine Corps historical archives, explained how Corsair pilots were systematically exploiting the Lufbery Circle's fundamental weakness. Bauer wrote that the defensive circle only worked when all aircraft involved had similar performance envelopes. When one side had dramatically superior vertical performance, the circle became what he called a revolving door, easy to enter from above, impossible to exit toward altitude, and absolutely lethal to anyone trapped inside, rotating predictably. The physics of the situation were brutal and inexorable. A Zero in a defensive circle was already in a turn, which meant the aircraft was generating lift to change direction rather than to climb. The wing was working hard just to maintain the turning circle. To transition from this turning flight into a vertical climb required the pilot to simultaneously roll wings level, pull back on the stick to redirect the lift vector upward, and apply full power. Even executed perfectly, this transition took several seconds and bled enormous amounts of energy. By the time the Zero had completed this transition and begun climbing, the Corsair had already climbed several thousand feet and was positioning for another attack. Marine and Navy fighter directors began circulating tactical bulletins describing the most effective methods for breaking Lufbery circles. The recommended approach involved patience and discipline. A division of 4 Corsairs would assign 1 aircraft to make the initial attack, while the other 3 maintained altitude as top cover. The attacking pilot would dive, fire, and climb away vertically. If the defensive circle held formation, the second Corsair would attack from a different angle 30 seconds later, then the third, then the fourth. Each attack would come from an unexpected vector, forcing the defensive formation to constantly adjust. Each vertical escape would demonstrate to the Japanese pilots that they couldn't pursue effectively. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was significant and cumulative. Imagine being in a defensive formation that had always worked before. You're flying in careful coordination with your squadron mates, each of you protecting the others. You see an American fighter diving toward you at tremendous speed. You turn toward him, preparing to fire as he passes. But instead of passing through your formation or pulling into a turning fight, he fires a brief burst and then simply climbs straight up, so steeply that it looks nearly vertical. You try to follow, but your aircraft won't climb at that angle without stalling. The American disappears above you, and 30 seconds later, another Corsair dives from a completely different direction. After 5 or 10 minutes of this, you've expended ammunition firing at attackers who are only in your gun sight for fractions of a second. You're exhausted from constant high-G turns trying to maintain formation. Your fuel is running low because turning combat burns gasoline at prodigious rates, and you've watched 1 or 2 of your squadron mates get shot down by attacks you couldn't prevent. The formation that was supposed to protect you has become a prison. You can't leave because individual fighters are even more vulnerable. You can't fight back effectively because the Americans control the engagement terms completely, and you can't escape upward because your aircraft simply doesn't have the performance. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 1st and 2nd, 1943, provided a large-scale demonstration of how thoroughly Corsair tactics had invalidated the Lufbery Circle as a defensive formation. American carrier task forces and land-based Marine air groups provided cover for amphibious landings at Cape Torokina on Bougainville Island. Japanese naval aviation launched multiple strikes from Rabaul, attempting to destroy the American invasion fleet. These strikes included experienced fighter pilots who'd been rotated back from forward bases for rest and retraining. They were among the best aviators Japan still had in the South Pacific. During engagements on November 1st, American Corsair pilots from VMF 214, VMF 221, and VMF 212 intercepted Japanese fighter sweeps and bomber raids. In multiple instances, Japanese Zero pilots formed Lufbery circles when bounced by American fighters diving from altitude. The Corsair pilots executed coordinated attacks exactly as they'd trained, with one aircraft diving through the circle while others maintained altitude. The results were one-sided. American fighters shot down 18 Zeros during the day's engagements while losing only 3 Corsairs, and 2 of those losses were attributed to anti-aircraft fire rather than aerial combat. Japanese after-action reports from survivors of these engagements reveal growing awareness that something fundamental had changed in Pacific air combat. One report, translated by American intelligence officers, described how Zero pilots had attempted standard defensive formations, but found American fighters attacking from above with impunity. The report noted that American aircraft could climb away faster than Zeros could pursue, making it impossible to convert defensive formation into offensive action. The document concluded with a recommendation that units avoid forming defensive circles when engaged by the new American fighters, though it offered no alternative tactic beyond attempting to maintain altitude advantage and energy. This absence of alternative tactics revealed the fundamental problem facing Japanese naval aviation by late 1943. The Lufbery Circle had been a cornerstone of fighter doctrine for decades. It was taught to every student pilot, practiced extensively, and employed instinctively in combat. Telling pilots not to use the formation was like telling them not to breathe. But what should they do instead? Individual maneuvering combat favoured the Zero's turning ability, but Corsair and Hellcat pilots had learned not to turn. They'd fight in vertical dimension, where American aircraft held overwhelming advantages. Maintaining altitude advantage required Japanese pilots to be above American fighters, but American fighters typically bounced Japanese formations from above using radar-directed intercepts and superior climb rates. Japanese training doctrine, designed and implemented during the 1930s based on operations over China, emphasized individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. The training pipeline produced aviators who could execute aerobatic maneuvers with precision and fight tenaciously in turning combat. But by 1943, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than the training system could replace them. New pilots arriving at operational squadrons had received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages, compressed timelines, and lack of experienced instructors who'd been pulled forward to combat units. These barely trained aviators were thrust into combat against American pilots, who averaged 300 or more flight hours and had received systematic instruction in energy tactics designed specifically to exploit superior vertical performance. The capability gap was widening rapidly. American industrial production was flooding the Pacific with newer, higher-performance aircraft, while Japanese factories struggled to maintain production of existing designs. The F4U Corsair production ramped up throughout 1943, with Chance Vaught's Stratford, Connecticut facility building hundreds of aircraft per month. Goodyear and Brewster received contracts to build additional Corsairs under license, eventually producing over 12,000 aircraft combined. Every carrier and Marine Air Group was transitioning to Corsairs or the equally capable F-6F Hellcat. Meanwhile, Japan continued producing the A-6M0, an aircraft whose basic design dated to 1939 and which had received only incremental improvements since entering service. By December 1943, American fighter squadrons across the Pacific had accumulated enough combat data to understand precisely why the Lufbery Circle had become a death trap against Corsairs and Hellcats. Intelligence officers compiled reports from dozens of engagements, and the pattern was unmistakable. Japanese pilots continued forming defensive circles when outnumbered or surprised, and American pilots had developed systematic procedures for dismantling these formations with minimal risk. Commander James Flatley, who'd become one of the Navy's premier tactical instructors after his combat tour at Guadalcanal, published a detailed analysis of Lufbery Circle vulnerabilities in the Fighter Tactics Manual distributed to carrier air groups in January 1944. Flatley's document explained that the defensive circle relied on three assumptions that had been valid in World War I but were no longer true in 1943. First, the assumption that attacking aircraft would be forced to pass through the circle's crossfire. Vertical attacks from above and steep climbs to escape invalidated this assumption completely. Second, the assumption that defenders could threaten attackers enough to force disengagement. When attackers could climb away faster than defenders could follow, this threat disappeared entirely. Third, the assumption that all aircraft involved had similar performance characteristics. The 2,000 horsepower difference between Corsairs and Zeros made this assumption obsolete. Flatley's tactical manual provided specific guidance for engaging Lufbery circles. He recommended that division leaders assign specific targets before commencing attack runs. The first attacker should select the 0 at the 12 o'clock position in the circle. The second attacker would target 3 o'clock. The third would take 6 o'clock. The fourth would hold high cover and engage any Japanese fighters attempting to climb out of the circle. This coordinated approach prevented multiple Corsairs from wasting ammunition shooting at the same target, while other defenders went unmolested. The manual also emphasized patience. Flatley wrote that breaking a Lufbery circle wasn't about aggressive pressing of attacks. It was about systematic application of superior performance over time. Each attacking Corsair should make one clean pass, fire a concentrated burst of 2 to 3 seconds, and then immediately climb away. No chasing, no attempting to observe results, no trying to maneuver for a second shot on the same pass. Just attack, shoot, climb, reposition. The defenders would be forced to maintain their circle, burning fuel and ammunition, while attackers could cycle through repeatedly from altitude. Eventually, the defensive formation would collapse through attrition, fuel exhaustion, or psychological strain. The training pipeline back in the United States incorporated these lessons rapidly. By early 1944, student pilots at Naval Air Station Jacksonville and Marine Corps Air Station El Toro were practicing attacks on simulated defensive circles. Instructors would fly 4 aircraft in a Lufbery circle, while students made diving attacks and climbing escapes. The training emphasized that individual gunnery was less important than maintaining proper attack geometry and energy management. A student who made a poor firing pass but executed a perfect vertical escape received higher marks than one who scored hits but failed to climb away cleanly. The message was clear. Staying alive to make multiple attacks mattered more than scoring on any single pass. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, who would finish the war as one of the Navy's top aces with 23 confirmed victories, developed an even more sophisticated approach to breaking defensive circles. Valencia created what he called the mowing machine formation, 4 Corsairs or Hellcats, flying in a carefully choreographed pattern that allowed continuous attacks on defensive formations. 2 pairs of fighters would work in coordination, with one pair diving to attack while the other pair positioned for follow-up runs. As soon as the first pair climbed away, the second pair would dive from a different angle. The defensive circle never got more than 30 seconds of respite between attacks. Valencia's formation required extraordinary discipline and communication. Pilots had to constantly track not only enemy positions, but also the locations of their squadron mates. Diving through the same airspace another Corsair was climbing through was a recipe for mid-air collision. Radio discipline had to be perfect so that pilots could make split-second timing calls without cluttering the frequency. But when executed properly, the mowing machine was devastatingly effective. Valencia's division used this tactic throughout 1944 and achieved a kill ratio exceeding 30-1 against Japanese fighters. The escalating Allied offensive through the Central Pacific during 1944 put increasing pressure on remaining Japanese air units. Operations against the Marshall Islands in January and February, followed by strikes on Truk in February, and the Marianas Campaign, beginning in June, forced Japanese naval aviation to defend across an impossibly wide front with dwindling resources. Fighter pilots, who might have received weeks of rest and retraining between combat deployments in 1942, now flew missions continuously until they were killed or their units were destroyed. The psychological and physical exhaustion was immense. Under these conditions, Japanese pilots clung even more desperately to familiar tactics that had worked in the past. The Lufbery Circle represented something psychologically comforting. It was a formation they'd trained on extensively. It created an illusion of mutual protection and coordinated defense, when everything else in the war was going wrong, falling back on established. Doctrine felt safer than attempting improvised solutions. But this psychological comfort was exactly what made the tactic so lethal. Pilots would form the defensive circle, feel momentarily secure in the familiar formation, and then die anyway as American fighters exploited vertical performance advantages that Japanese doctrine hadn't adapted to counter. Intelligence intercepts throughout early 1944 revealed Japanese awareness of the problem, but inability to solve it. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, based at Pearl Harbor, monitored Japanese naval aviation frequencies during major engagements. American translators documented multiple instances of Japanese flight leaders transmitting warnings about American vertical tactics. One intercept from February 19, 1944, during strikes on Truk, recorded a Japanese squadron commander ordering his pilots to avoid forming defensive circles against the new American fighters. The transmission specified that pilots should instead attempt to maintain altitude advantage and engage only when positionally favorable. But changing ingrained tactical behavior under combat stress proved nearly impossible. A pilot who'd formed Lufbery circles dozens or hundreds of times would instinctively revert to that formation when surprised or outnumbered, regardless of what standing orders said. The tactical bulletin might be read in a briefing room before the mission, but in the cockpit with American fighters diving from above and wingmen calling for mutual support, muscle memory and training took over. Japanese pilots continued forming defensive circles throughout 1944, and American pilots continued dismantling those circles with systematic efficiency. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the most dramatic demonstration of how thoroughly American naval aviation had mastered vertical fighting and how completely Japanese defensive tactics had failed to adapt. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 deployed 15 aircraft carriers with over 900 aircraft, including 475 Hellcats and numerous Corsairs operating from marine bases in the Marianas. Japanese Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet launched multiple strike waves from 9 carriers, hoping to destroy American amphibious forces off Saipan. American radar detected incoming Japanese raids at distances exceeding 100 miles, giving fighter directors time to position Hellcats and Corsairs at optimal intercept altitudes. When Japanese formations appeared, they found themselves confronted by American fighters holding every positional advantage. The Americans were higher, faster, and flying aircraft with superior performance. Japanese bomber formations scattered under coordinated attacks. Japanese fighter escorts attempted to protect the bombers but found themselves overwhelmed by American fighters that could attack from above and escape vertically before effective defensive fire could be brought to bear. In multiple instances during the day's fighting, Japanese Zero pilots formed Lufbery circles when their formations were broken up. American pilots, many of them veterans with months or years of combat experience, recognized the defensive formation instantly and executed practiced attacks. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Essex Air Group from his F6F Hellcat, personally attacked a defensive circle of 5 Zeros during the afternoon engagement. McCampbell made 6 separate diving attacks over 12 minutes, shooting down 2 Zeros and damaging 2 others. His wingmen destroyed the remaining aircraft. McCampbell's combat report noted that the Japanese pilots maintained their circular formation even as aircraft were shot out of the wheel, never breaking away or attempting alternative tactics. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics from June 19th were staggering. Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 243 carrier-based aircraft and 50 land-based aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, with most falling to anti-aircraft fire rather than air-to-air combat. The kill ratio exceeded 10-1. Pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured both the one-sided nature of the combat and the systematic nature of American gunnery. Japanese pilots weren't fighting and dying. They were being methodically shot down by an opponent that controlled every aspect of the engagement. Japanese after-action reports from surviving pilots revealed deep demoralization. Several reports mentioned defensive formations that failed to protect against American attacks. One pilot's account, translated by American intelligence, described forming a defensive circle with 3 other Zeros after their bomber formation was scattered. The pilot reported that American fighters attacked repeatedly from above, that attempts to climb after the attackers proved futile, and that the defensive circle collapsed after 2 Zeros were shot down in rapid succession. The account concluded that current defensive tactics were insufficient against American aircraft and that new methods were urgently needed. But new methods never materialized. Japanese Naval Aviation Command issued various tactical directives throughout the summer of 1944, but these directives mostly emphasized what not to do rather than providing effective alternatives. Pilots were told to avoid turning combat with American fighters, to avoid defensive circles, to avoid climbing engagements. The directives rarely specified what pilots should do instead, because there wasn't a good answer. The performance deficit was so large that no tactical innovation could compensate for it. The Japanese did develop improved fighter designs during 1944. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and Kawanishi N-1KJ Shiden offered significantly better performance than the Zero, with climb rates and speeds approaching American aircraft. But production problems, engine reliability issues, and chronic shortages of critical materials meant these aircraft never reached operational units in significant numbers. The Raiden suffered from persistent engine overheating that limited its combat effectiveness. The Shiden, adapted from a floatplane fighter design, inherited complex landing gear that caused maintenance nightmares and high accident rates. Even when these superior fighters did reach squadrons, pilot quality had degraded so severely that the aircraft's capabilities couldn't be fully exploited. The training pipeline collapse was killing Japanese naval aviation more surely than any combat losses. Pre-war Japanese pilot training required 300 to 700 flight hours before a pilot joined an operational squadron. These men were genuinely elite aviators, comparable to the best pilots any nation produced. But combat consumed them faster than the training system could replace them. By mid-1944, New Japanese pilots arrived at squadrons with 100 flight hours or less. Some had as few as 40 hours total time. These barely trained aviators flew against American pilots who averaged 300 hours plus extensive gunnery and tactical training. The capability gap wasn't just about flight time. It was about what happened during those hours. American training emphasized energy management, tactical discipline, and systematic exploitation of performance advantages. Students practiced vertical fighting until it became instinctive. They learned to assess energy states, judge optimal attack angles, and execute coordinated attacks with wingmen. Japanese training, abbreviated by fuel shortages and compressed timelines, focused on basic flying skills and individual combat maneuvers. New pilots learned to take off, land, and perform aerobatic maneuvers, but they received minimal instruction in advanced tactics or coordinated fighting. They certainly didn't learn effective counters to vertical attacks or methods for breaking American defensive formations. Some experienced Japanese pilots did adapt individually. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with over 60 confirmed victories, described in his memoir how he modified his tactics after encountering Hellcats and Corsairs. Sakai avoided climbing combat entirely. He refused to form defensive circles. Instead, he used hit-and-run attacks from favorable positions and immediately disengaged before American fighters could respond. He survived the war with these tactics, but Sakai was exceptional. He had over 500 combat missions and years of experience reading aerial situations. His individual adaptation couldn't be replicated by novice pilots who lacked the fundamental skills and combat intuition required for such nuanced flying. By late 1944, the Lufbery Circle had transformed from a defensive tactic into what American pilots called a beacon. When Japanese pilots formed the circular formation, they were essentially advertising their position and signaling that they were trapped in a defensive posture with no escape. American fighter divisions would spot these circles from miles away, often multiple circles formed by different Japanese units. Division leaders would assign targets and organize systematic attacks. The circles would be broken apart one by one, with Japanese pilots shot down or forced to scatter. Those who scattered individually were hunted down by American fighters that could outrun, outclimb, and outgun them. The Philippines campaign from October through December 1944 demonstrated the complete breakdown of Japanese fighter effectiveness. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf and subsequent air campaigns over Luzon, Japanese naval aviation threw everything remaining into desperate attacks on American invasion forces. Kamikaze tactics emerged partly because conventional fighter tactics had proven so ineffective that suicide attacks offered better probability of damaging American ships. But even kamikaze escorts formed defensive circles when engaged by American fighters, and those circles were dismantled with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized Pacific air combat for the previous year. Marine Corsair squadrons and Navy Hellcat squadrons operating from escort carriers achieved kill ratios during the Philippines campaign that approached 20-1 in some engagements. These weren't elite units with exceptional pilots. These were average squadrons with replacement pilots fresh from training. The tactical system had become so refined and American aircraft performance advantages so overwhelming that even average execution produced dominant results. Japanese pilots, many of them, barely trained and flying obsolete aircraft, stood almost no chance regardless of what tactics they employed. The strategic situation made everything worse for Japanese aviation. By 1945, Japan was fighting defensively across a contracting perimeter. Fighter pilots couldn't choose favorable engagement conditions because they had to defend fixed installations, shipping, and homeland approaches. American carrier task forces attacked when and where they chose, always with numerical superiority, always with performance advantages, and always with the option to disengage if conditions turned unfavorable. Japanese pilots had no such options. They were forced to scramble and engage even when outnumbered, outpositioned, and outclassed. Fuel shortages compounded every problem exponentially. Advanced pilot training requires fuel for flight hours. Japan's synthetic fuel production and dwindling petroleum imports meant training was cut even shorter than personnel shortages alone would have dictated. Operational squadrons received reduced fuel allocations, limiting their ability to maintain proficiency through practice flights. Some units couldn't afford training sorties at all, meaning pilots only flew during actual combat missions. Maintaining edge-of-envelope skills, the kind of high-energy maneuvering required to exploit or counter vertical tactics, was impossible without regular practice. Japanese pilots flew less, trained less, and died faster. The final problem was cultural and psychological. Japanese military culture emphasized aggressive offensive spirit, the concept of seishin or fighting spirit. Tactical directives that told pilots to avoid certain types of combat contradicted deeply ingrained cultural values. Some pilots felt that refusing to engage or employing defensive tactics was dishonorable. This cultural resistance to realistic tactical adaptation meant some pilots ignored warnings entirely and engaged American fighters in exactly the types of combat they'd been told to avoid. They died maintaining concepts of honor that had no place in modern aerial warfare, and their deaths accomplished nothing except adding to American victory tallies. When the last guns fell silent over Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the Lufbery Circle's transformation from defensive tactic to death trap stood as one of the war's clearest examples of how technological and tactical evolution could render proven methods not just obsolete, but actively suicidal. The statistics were brutal. In engagements where Japanese pilots formed Lufbery Circles against Corsairs or Hellcats during 1944 and 45, American kill ratios averaged 15-1 or higher. Japanese pilots in defensive circles had lower survival rates than those who scattered and attempted individual evasion. The F4U Corsair's combat record reflected its dominance. Corsairs achieved an overall kill ratio of 11-1 against Japanese aircraft throughout the Pacific War. Marine Corps Corsair squadrons claimed over 2,000 victories, while losing fewer than 200 aircraft in air-to-air combat. Navy and Marine pilots flying Corsairs produced over a dozen aces with 10 or more victories, including Gregory Boyington with 22 victories in Corsairs and Kenneth Walsh with 17. These numbers represented systematic tactical superiority, not just individual skill. The F6F Hellcats record was even more dominant, with a kill ratio exceeding 19-1. Combined, Corsairs and Hellcats destroyed over 7,000 Japanese aircraft while suffering fewer than 500 losses in aerial combat. The vertical performance advantage that allowed these aircraft to dismantle Lufbery Circles was the foundation underlying this dominance. American pilots could control engagement terms completely, attacking when favorable and extending away when not. Japanese pilots, trapped in defensive formations or scattered individually, had no effective counter. Individual pilot achievements illustrated how thoroughly American tactics had evolved. Commander David McCampbell's 34 confirmed victories made him the Navy's top ace. Lieutenant Cecil Harris finished with 24 victories, all in Hellcats. Major Gregory Boyington's combined total of 28 victories, including his Flying Tigers kills and Corsair victories, made him the Marine Corps' leading ace. These men weren't just talented pilots. They were tacticians who understood energy management, vertical fighting, and systematic exploitation of performance advantages. The Lufbery Circle's failure represented something larger than just one outdated tactic. It symbolized Japanese naval aviation's inability to adapt to changing technological and tactical realities. The formation had worked brilliantly in World War I and adequately in the early Pacific War, when aircraft performance was relatively balanced. But when American industry produced fighters with overwhelming power to weight advantages, and when American training pipelines taught pilots to exploit those advantages systematically, the Lufbery Circle became a fatal trap. Japanese aviation recognized this problem, issued warnings about it, but could never develop effective alternatives because the underlying performance deficit was too large to overcome through tactics alone. The doctrine that produced the Lufbery Circle emphasized mutual support, coordinated defense, and leveraging numerical positioning over individual performance. These were sound principles, but they assumed all participants were playing the same game with similar tools. When one side developed tools that changed the game fundamentally, specifically aircraft that could fight in the vertical dimension with impunity, those sound principles became death sentences. Japanese pilots, who faithfully executed their training and formed defensive circles exactly as doctrine prescribed, were killed by American pilots who'd learned to fight differently. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese aviators revealed deep bitterness about this transformation. They'd been trained extensively in tactics that worked, had used those tactics successfully for years, and then watched helplessly as the same tactics failed catastrophically. Saburo Sakai, who survived to become one of Japan's most famous aces, stated in his memoir that the introduction of Corsairs and Hellcats marked the definitive turning point in Pacific air combat. Other veterans described the psychological impact of being trapped in defensive circles, while American fighters attacked from above with complete impunity. The warrior culture that had sustained Japanese military effectiveness for decades couldn't overcome fundamental material disadvantage, and the Lufbery Circle represented that disadvantage in its most concentrated and lethal form. The tactical lessons from the Lufbery Circle's failure influenced American fighter doctrine for decades. The emphasis on vertical performance, energy management, and boom and zoom tactics became foundational concepts for jet fighter design. Korean War F-86. Sabre pilots used energy fighting and vertical tactics almost identical to what Corsair and Hellcat pilots had developed against Japanese defensive circles. Vietnam-era fighter pilots, who'd forgotten these lessons and tried to turn fight agile, MiG-17 seconds in heavy F-4 Phantoms relearned them painfully, leading to establishment of Top Gun and Red Flag advanced training programs that re-emphasized energy fighting principles. Modern fighter tactics still emphasize concepts that would be immediately recognizable to Pacific War Corsair pilots. Control the vertical dimension, maintain energy advantage, attack from positions of strength and extend away from disadvantageous engagements. Use superior performance systematically, rather than relying on individual heroics. These principles, refined against Lufbery circles over Pacific combat zones during 1943 through 45, remain relevant in an era of supersonic jets and beyond visual range missiles. The Lufbery Circle itself remains taught in military history courses as a cautionary example of how technological change can transform proven tactics from assets into liabilities. The formation worked for 25 years because the underlying assumption that all aircraft had broadly similar performance characteristics remained valid. When that assumption changed, the tactic didn't just become obsolete, it became actively dangerous, concentrating defenders in predictable patterns that attackers with superior performance could exploit systematically. This lesson applies far beyond aerial combat. Any tactical or strategic system built on assumptions about technological parity becomes vulnerable when that parity disappears. For the Japanese pilots who died in Lufbery circles over the Pacific, there's a particular tragedy. They weren't cowards or incompetents. They were aviators following their training, executing coordinated defensive tactics exactly as doctrine prescribed, trusting in methods that had protected pilots for decades. They did everything right according to their understanding of aerial combat, but they'd been trained to fight a war that no longer existed. The Corsairs and Hellcats diving from above represented not just better aircraft, but a completely different philosophy of air combat, one that Japanese training and doctrine never successfully adapted to counter. The morning of October 15th, 1943, when Lieutenant Tom Blackburn watched those 4 Zeros form their defensive circle, represented a moment of transition that the Japanese pilots couldn't perceive. They were executing a maneuver that felt safe, proven, and tactically sound. They couldn't see that the circle which had saved pilots' lives for 25 years had become a death spiral. The same formation that created interlocking fields of defensive fire now created a static target that Blackburn's Corsair could attack repeatedly from the vertical dimension. The Zeros turned and turned, protecting each other exactly as they'd been trained, while Blackburn dove and climbed, systematically shooting them down one by one. That's the essential tragedy of the Lufbery Circle's transformation. The Japanese pilots weren't making mistakes. They were trusting in proven methods that had suddenly, catastrophically, stopped working. The defensive wheel that had protected generations of fighter pilots had become the mechanism of their destruction, and there was nothing they could do about it except die while maintaining perfect formation discipline. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.